I got to fix that orientation. I don't like the orientation like this, but for tonight, I'll just go ahead and stick with that. Again, and I apologize for it being a little bit difficult to see there. But in any case, thanks for joining in. I'll give it a few minutes here for a few people to join on. I wanted to give people just sort of an overview of what's going on in the DB Cooper case right now, how we're zeroing in, or how a few of us are actually zeroing in on DB Cooper. I do believe that 2025 is a critical year as far as this investigation is concerned. I think science is finally catching up to this guy. It's taken 53 years, but I do believe science is finally catching up to the guy. And I think there's a pretty good chance that by the end of the year, we'll have a pretty good idea of who this guy was. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And if you want to ask questions or whatever, feel free to do that. I believe that I'm prepared to read those questions if they come over there. If not, then sorry. We'll just have to put them in the comments and I'll get to them later. But anyway, let's give you a couple of minutes for a few other people to join on here. And then we'll talk a little bit about the case here. So either way, hope you're having your good, what is it, Wednesday? Yeah, Wednesday. Hope you're having a good Wednesday. Enjoying some coffee tonight. No beer, just coffee. So black coffee at that. So any case, hi there, Robin. How you doing? So anyway, let me go ahead and get started here. And again, in the future, I promise I'm going to reorient this thing here. I guess it's probably a matter of just how I initially set it up, the initial settings. I just don't like this portrait mode. I prefer the landscape mode. But either way, enough of that. You know, it's been 53 years again since the case, since DB Cooper skyjacked the jet November 24, 1971. And I'm going to kind of just review and kind of give a summary here. I'm assuming that a lot of the people here that are going to ultimately end up watching this thing have a vague idea of what happened, but they may not be in the weeds to the degree that some of us are in the weeds. So this isn't, you know, going to be some super high level conversation. It's going to be, I'm going to sort of gear it toward people who have kind of a passing interest. Maybe they saw a documentary, maybe they read something, whatever the case may happen to be. And again, the objective here is just to give you an idea of what is taking place right now. And I can speak primarily to what I'm doing to zero in on DB Cooper to figure out who this guy was. And again, like I said a few minutes ago, I actually believe we're getting very close to figuring out who this guy is. Again, primarily because science is catching up to the guy. And as far as I'll say that as far as the documentation, the continual flow of documents that are coming out through the Freedom of Information Act or what have you, it's been a while since there's really been anything of import that I've seen in that thing. It seems like most of the really important stuff, the stuff that mattered as far as I'm concerned, that stuff came out early on. And a lot of what's coming out now is just, you know, I don't know. I'm not finding it to be of particular value, whatever the case may happen to be. Where I think the real value is, what I'm particularly excited about is everything related to the evidence we have. And the evidence we have obviously relates to the tie, specifically the tie particles, also the money, the diatom, some of the stuff related to the $6,000 that was found February 12th, 1980. And then, of course, you know, witness testimony and that kind of thing, bearing in mind what we believe DB Cooper looked like. You know, we can discuss some of his mannerisms, his lack of an accent. He appeared to be an American. Obviously, the knowledge he demonstrated, that kind of thing. So that's its own form of evidence right there. So I'll say that from the get-go, I think that there are a few primary reasons why the authorities were unsuccessful in figuring out who this guy was. And I think to simplify it, I think it's simply a matter of just underestimating their enemy. I think that's the primary thing, is they underestimated their enemy. They figured, I think, within the immediate hours after this, that we're gonna find this guy dead in the ground or hanging from a tree or what have you. And there was sort of a very casual, kind of laid back swagger that law enforcement had as far as this is concerned there. And I think that they were shocked very quickly as they started searching for him. They were shocked to discover that there was no sign of him at all anywhere, and that maybe the guy actually walked away. Maybe the guy actually got away with it. It seems to me that a lot of law enforcement just assume that some crazy dude jumping out of an airliner 10,000 feet up, 200 miles an hour, couldn't survive. You know, a little blustery Pacific Northwest weather, that type of thing. But I think, you know, as time has gone on here, and we've had other experts, parachute experts and others who jump recreationally have discussed, the jump actually really wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't that big of a deal at all. So, and hold on a second. It says, you and Sheridan Peterson, you said Sheridan Peterson was DB Cooper. You said Vince Peterson. Have you come up with a new suspect? Okay, first of all, let me interject, Steve. I never said that Sheridan Peterson or Vince Peterson was DB Cooper. I said that in my mind, I considered them, in the case of Sheridan Peterson, likely to have been DB Cooper. I said 98% certain, but by definition, there's that 2% outlier. That's 2%. I could never close the deal on Sheridan Peterson. And now I don't believe that Sheridan Peterson was DB Cooper. And the same thing with Vince Peterson. Vince Peterson, I said many times before, I don't know if the guy was DB Cooper or not, but I felt like either he was DB Cooper or he was very close to DB Cooper in some fashion. And this is driven by the evidence. But again, with the newer stuff, the newer evidence that's come to light, specifically the uranium and thorium, that leads me away from Vince Peterson. And actually, I think it's better to say it leads me away from Rem Crew titanium, and it leads me away from crucible steel. That's where I was initially focused. And given that that's where Vince Peterson was Rem Crew, later crucible steel, that by definition removes Vince Peterson from the equation. So I want to be very clear about that. I've heard a number of people sort of mischaracterize what I've said related to persons of interest and things that I've looked at there, and I've been very, very clear about that. I mean, I've been very specific about that. And again, I don't know. I don't know who DB Cooper was. I don't even have a prime suspect at this point. And that's just being perfectly honest. At some point, perhaps I'll drill down and find somebody that I find intriguing that came from Union Carbide, worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, maybe had some sort of tangential relationship to the molten salt reactor experiment there. I don't know. But I'll just tell you right now that, you know, if we're interested in figuring out who this guy was, those who are serious investigators have got to exercise a level of intellectual honesty. And intellectual honesty dictates that as new evidence comes in, we learn new things, new facts come to light, whatever the case may happen to be, that we factor that into the equation. Because I think a very good analogy of what we've got going on here is we've got a jigsaw puzzle with a lot of pieces missing. We have a handful of pieces, but we have a lot of pieces missing. And all we can do is work with the pieces we have and try to kind of piece it together and then figure out what the rest of the puzzle that's missing looks like. Where every once in a while, bing, a new piece of the puzzle plops on the table. And I think that happened recently with this uranium and thorium stuff. And when that new piece of the puzzle plops on the table and we find out, you know, we kind of look at that, we add that to the puzzle, the pieces that we have, that can change things there. So to get back to what I was saying there, again, talking about, you know, why it is I think that DB Cooper got away. I think one of the primary reasons, like I said, is that ultimately law enforcement just basically misjudged their enemy as far as that's concerned. They just figure they had it in the bag. They're just going to find some dude, no pulled in the ground somewhere, or whatever the case may happen to be. Or perhaps they thought, the guy's going to be reckless. It's just a matter of time before he goes to, an auto dealership and just decides to buy a brand spanking new Cadillac with, brand new cash, and we figure out who the guy is. Something of that nature. Yet it doesn't appear to have happened. So again, I think DB Cooper was just one step ahead of the authorities the entire way, and he stayed one step ahead of the authorities the entire way. And I think that he executed what was pretty darn close to a flawless operation. And I think that in and of itself tells you something about the man. The fact that he hasn't been caught, that fact alone, I think, is something that is worth considering when you consider who was DB Cooper. What kind of individual are we looking for? it seems to me that it's highly unlikely that it would have been somebody like a Dwayne Weber, for example, who basically was honestly kind of a shitty criminal. The guy got caught a number of times. He wasn't particularly good, from what I can tell, as far as being a criminal is concerned. When we talk about Wolfgang Gossett, a guy who, quote unquote, confessed to a number of people and told people that he was D.B. Cooper, again, that just doesn't sound like the real D.B. Cooper to me. The real D.B. Cooper got away with this for a reason, and I think part of the reason why is because he just didn't talk. He was very, very buttoned up about it. Now, there may have been a spouse or somebody that knew about it, but I mean, I think it was a very, very closed, very, very tight circle as far as that's concerned. And D.B. Cooper may have been the only person that knew that this happened there. And that's not to say he didn't have family, a wife, kids, or what have you. He may well have had a wife and kids, and they may have been left out of the loop as well. We just don't know. All I'm saying is that D.B. Cooper obviously had the ability, in my mind, to keep a secret. And moreover, when you look at how the plan was executed, it was basically flawless. Yeah, there were a couple of errors, I think, along the way, and a couple of things that could have tripped this guy up. But again, we're looking at it in retrospect here. He was living this in real time, and I think there were some real problems, some real challenges that occurred in real time. Not the least of which was the delay in getting the money to the airplane, the fact that the money wasn't secured in a knapsack, that it was in an open top bank bag. A couple of things like that ended up really sort of jamming him up and creating some problems here. But he ultimately, I think he improvised effectively and managed to get away with it. So as far as we know, and I do believe that D.B. Cooper got away with it. But I will say that the overall approach that I've taken with the case is this firm belief that as far as law enforcement is concerned, someone made a mistake somewhere, somehow, at some time. And I think that's obvious in my mind. Mistakes were made on the part of law enforcement, specifically the FBI. And I've always felt like my job as a serious investigator, and frankly, as somebody who wants to figure out who this guy is, part of my job is to figure out where those mistakes occurred. Now, I'm not besmirching the FBI by announcing, these guys made mistakes and these were areas where they made mistakes. It's just a cold, hard, objective way of proceeding with this investigation, is trying to identify the mistakes and then see if something new can come of that to the degree that a mistake is identified. And the other thing is that, I have a really big advantage. I've got 53 years of knowledge related to the case that the agents back then in 1971, 1972 didn't have. And I've also got state-of-the-art technology and things like that I can leverage that they certainly didn't have back then, whether we're talking DNA testing, whether we're talking the internet, whether we're talking scanning electron microscopes, whether we're talking the Facebook group, the D.B. Cooper Mystery Group that's brought together, over 5,000 people, some of whom are experts in various areas, and we can kind of group think some of these things out, which I think is very, very helpful. So there are a lot of advantages here that I have, and that those of us who are looking into the case now have, that they didn't have some 53 years ago when the skyjacking took place. Now let's speak about some of the mistakes that I've identified. Or well, let me rephrase it. I didn't identify, but some of the mistakes that were clearly made. One of them, obviously, was the belief on the part of many people that D.B. Cooper died and we were going to find a corpse. And obviously that never happened. So I do think that prevailing attitude, that seemed to prevail in law enforcement early on, I think created its own set of problems. And that, in part, enabled him to walk away, to get away. The other really big mistake relates to the money, when the money was found in 1980. Now, I've talked about this many, many times before, but the FBI, after money was found on Tina Bar, the $6,000 was found buried in the sand along the Columbia River at a place called Tina Bar. the FBI hired a guy from Portland State University, a guy named Dr. Leonard Palmer, who was an expert in strata, looking at strata and that type of thing. And that certainly seemed to be a prudent course of action for the FBI to take, to hire Dr. Palmer to take a look at the strata on the beach where the money was found and see if there was anything that we could learn or they could learn about the money appearing there 8 years later on the beach. Very rotted, decayed, everything else. And there were some trenches dug, and Dr. Palmer looked at the different strata layers, so forth. And apparently, what he actually said, what he actually announced, was that the money was found on top of a layer of dredge spoils that had been placed upon that beach, that part of the beach there, in 1974. I believe it was August of 1974. So Dr. Leonard Palmer, and the FBI for that matter, reasonably deduced, well, if the money was found on top of a layer of sand that was placed on the beach in August of 1974, and the skyjacking was November of 1971, by definition, the money in all likelihood arrived on Tina Bar after August of 1974. And to them, it didn't make sense that somebody years later would just go and bury 3 packets. That didn't make any sense, and I agree, it doesn't make any sense. Why would somebody do that? I mean, again, I'm not playing, fifth dimensional chess here, where there's this expectation that somebody's going to find it, and then that sort of, is going to cause the authorities to think that D.B. Cooper died, or whatever the case may happen to be. I mean, consider this. The money was found in 1980. Like, at this point, I think the game was already over. D.B. Cooper had, in effect, already won. So why the fuck would you be giving them any more evidence at all to work with? I mean, you just leave well enough alone. It's been 8 years. You've gotten away with it. That's it. It just defies common sense to go back at some later date and bury 3 packets for whatever reason. So getting back to Dr. Leonard Palmer, in his evaluation of the strata on Tina Bar, he announced that, the money had to arrive after 1974, and that the authorities therefore started thinking, well, it had to have, somehow the money got to a point upstream from Tina Bar, which was very problematic because that didn't jive with the area, the drop zone that they believed D.B. Cooper jumped. So they started sort of like twisting in the wind here and figuring out, well, maybe he jumped a little later, maybe the jet was a little further east to let it be over the Washougal area, whatever the case may happen to be. They were basically forced to come up with some tortured explanations for how the money could have possibly ended up somewhere upstream from Tina Bar, and kind of hang out secretly for 8 years, I guess, until the river current just caught it somehow, 3 of the packets, and bingo, ended up magically buried on Tina Bar, which of course I think is just pure horseshit. I don't think there's any fucking possibility of that type of scenario happening. I think you could sit there for 1 trillion years and try to replicate that kind of scenario, and you will never have it happen. I literally think that that's impossible. But then again, if you're armed with, hey, the money showed up after August of 1974, you can kind of see that, why the authorities went in that direction, and why this, what's called the Washougal washdown theory, became all the rage. Well, it wasn't until years later, 28 years later, 2008, Tom Kay, Citizen Sleuth, started looking at Tina Bar at a different level. Again, science and everything is kind of advanced at this point. There's high altitude imagery and so forth that they've been able to take a look at. Mother Nature has stripped some of the beach and that kind of thing, so things have materially changed. A lot has happened in that 28 years. And to make a long story short, Tom Kay discovered in his group, but I think it was primarily Tom Kay, discovered photographic evidence that clearly showed that the dredge spoils that Dr. Leonard Palmer thought had been placed on the beach in August of 1974, where the money was found, actually was placed nowhere near where the money was found. Tom Kay identified a spot where he thought the money had been found, and he showed pictures of where the dredge spoils were, and you can see that they were spread out by a bulldozer by the Fazios, the gentleman who owned the property, who still own the property and still around today. And I know the Fazios well. I've talked with them on many occasions. But, you know, he clearly showed that now that the dredge spoils didn't actually reach the money find spot, that was a game changer, because then all of a sudden, no longer did the money have to arrive at Tina Bar after August of 1974. Indeed, the money could have arrived on Tina Bar on the night of the skyjacking, and that's actually what I believe happened. I believe the money was sitting there from November 24th, 1971, the night of the skyjacking. Now, it was years later, 2019, where I actually took a really cold, hard, objective look at Tina Bar and tried to ascertain precisely where the money was found as well. And I identified a flaw in Tom's location where he had showed the money being found. And it was actually even further away. The actual money find spot was actually further away than Tom had initially believed. So that even makes it even more less plausible, if that's a proper way to phrase it, more or less plausible that those were dredge spoils that were placed on there. But very importantly as well, as I was looking into it, I discovered that the actual dredge spoils that were placed on the beach, that were underneath the money find, that Dr. Leonard Palmer had identified as coming from 1974, those dredge spoils had actually been laid upon that spot in 1970. It was the year before the skyjacking when those dredge spoils had been laid upon the beach. So Dr. Leonard Palmer did indeed identify the layer of sand underneath the money as sand from dredge spoils. The mistake he made is he thought it was from 1974, not realizing that in actuality the dredge spoils were from 1970. And that's a critical error, considering that the skyjacking took place November 24, 1971. So what that means is that the money obviously didn't have to arrive after 1974, and I believe likely indicates that the money was arrived there actually the night of the skyjacking. Part of the reason that it was critically important to identify the precise money find spot is it's also very easy to identify, well, how far from the river's edge was it, at what kind of altitude above the river was the money found under normal conditions back then, and everything else. What was the flood history of the Columbia River? All this kind of information. And what I discovered is that the money was actually found about 40 or 50 feet from the water's edge. It was at an elevation about 9 feet above the level of the river under normal conditions. And that only on 2 occasions had the river flooded to the degree where it actually covered the money find spot with water, with Columbia River water. Once was June of 72, which was 7 months after the skyjacking, and once was July of 1974, which again was a good 2.5 years after the skyjacking took place. Now, why that's important is, by definition, if you want to believe that the money arrived there by natural means, that it arrived there by river flow or what have you, that means it would had to have arrived there either June of 72 or June, July of 1974. But there are some very big problems as far as that's concerned, because there were indications that rubber bands were still in place. The money was basically found together. The 3 packets were found together, and it becomes highly unlikely that those 3 packets and the individual bills would have remained relatively tight, close together if they've been hanging out in the wild somewhere for 2.5 years. Rubber bands and that kind of stuff doesn't last that long. And then somehow take a journey down the river for several miles, and then still somehow everything remains intact and it gets buried somehow by some sort of magical theory, just doesn't add up. So again, to me, that looked very much like the money had to have been buried there by a human being, by a person. And if it was buried by a human being, in all likelihood, that human being was D.B. Cooper himself. Now, fast forward even further to Tom Kay, who's brilliant as far as this case is concerned. and he discovered that that there were these things called diatoms. There were these things called diatoms, which are sort of like organisms that bloom in the Columbia River. They're seasonal. He found diatoms embedded in some of the bills, on one of the bills in particular, that he looked at under an electron microscope. And importantly, those diatoms indicate that the money did indeed get wet with Columbia River water, but it got wet in the summertime. It got wet in the summertime. It didn't get wet during the wintertime. So what that appears to prove, is that when D.B. Cooper jumped November 24, 1971, he didn't land in the Columbia River, or the money didn't land in the Columbia River, because if it had and it had gotten wet, there would have been wintertime diatoms found all over the money. Yet there weren't any wintertime diatoms found on the money. Coffee break here. Hold on a second here. So, so that's part of how, that's a perfect example where science has really kind of helped out, caught up. So let's talk a little bit about where the money was found. And let's consider that the money was found, that again was buried by a human being, and that there was only $6,000 found in everything else. Well, that ultimately got me really thinking about, well, how is that possible? How does the money end up there on Tina Bar? How come there's only $6,000, 3 packets? What happened to the rest? What happened to the other $194,000? It was in a bag. The last anybody knew. Blah 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 blah. And again, I think when you go back and you look at sort of, this is where the FBI files and the witness testimony and so forth becomes very critical. You begin to see that, D.B. Cooper, of course, ordered the money, requested or required rather that the money be delivered in a knapsack, and it wasn't delivered in a knapsack. It was delivered in this open top, cheap canvas bank bag. The money weighed about 20 pounds. And if you hold this bag up, I've got one of the bags, and if you put $200,000 in $20 bills in there, 20 pounds worth of $20 bills, you immediately recognize, at least I immediately recognized as I looked at it, is that single stitch, that single seam, that single stitch, which is all the bag was. These are cheap bags here. That damn thing wasn't going to hold. Jumping out of an airliner at 200 miles an hour, entering the jet stream at that kind of speed, with that kind of force hitting that bag, there is no way in hell that bag was gonna stay put together. I mean, it was gonna explode immediately. And I think D.B. Cooper immediately recognized that, and immediately recognized he had a problem. And we have witness testimony that indicates that D.B. Cooper tried to put the money into one of the parachutes. But as the witness describes that, apparently he gave up that effort, and whatever the case may happen to be. Well, I think that that's actually an error on the part of the witness, meaning that the witness I'm referring to is Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who was kind of in and around D.B. Cooper. This all happened during a time when there was a lot of moving and stuff going on. So Tina wasn't just sitting there literally observing this entire thing take place. She was actually busy retrieving parachutes and dealing with people, and all kinds of stuff was taking place. So she was catching glimpses and parts of what was taking place there. So I think ultimately what ended up happening is that a portion of the money was taken out of the bank bag, maybe half of it, maybe 10 pounds. Let's just take a guess, say maybe half of it was taken out. And I believe that was put into the parachute, the one missing reserve parachute. And I believe that is exactly what Tina Mucklow saw. And the rest of the money, I believe D.B. Cooper left in the bank bag. And the reason why is because neither the parachute was not large enough to hold all of the money. It could hold some of the money, but it certainly couldn't hold the full 20 pounds. And for D.B. Cooper's purposes, all he needed to do was lighten the load in that canvas bank bag. And lightening it, let's say, in half, taking it down to 10 pounds, well, that's a game changer, because now it's a relatively small package of money in this bank bag, and he could take shroud line he had cut from one of the parachutes, tie it up, wrap it around, and secure it reasonably well. And I think at that point, D.B. Cooper could be reasonably comfortable that when he jumps out at 200 miles an hour, that the money bag is going to maintain its integrity, that's going to hold together, and it's not going to pop open and the money's not going to fly out. So remember, that's what he did, and he obviously tied it to himself and some person. And I believe the missing parachute, because there was one reserve parachute that was missing, I believe that is the parachute that the Tina Mucklow saw some of the money being attempted to be wrapped into, and I think ultimately that's exactly what he used that parachute for, because there's no other reason to take that parachute with him. It didn't function. It didn't have clips to clip onto the main parachute, to the emergency rig he used. It was just bulk. There was no reason to take it with him. He may as well just left it on the plane with the other 2 parachutes he left on the plane. I mean, what was special about that parachute that he can't use for jumping purposes? What was so special about that parachute that he took it? I think what was so special about that parachute that he took it is clear. He used that to house some of the cash. So, having said that, I do believe, and I'm going to kind of skip forward here. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I do believe that D.B. Cooper actually landed pretty near where the money was found. I think that where D.B. Cooper jumped, where D.B. Cooper landed was one of those critical errors that law enforcement, that the FBI made. Just like the error on the part of the dredge spoils, 1974, all that is concerned, I do think there was another critical mistake that was made on the part of the law enforcement, and that specifically pertains to where D.B. Cooper actually landed. So suffice to say that I believe D.B. Cooper actually landed very near where the money was found, which was about 10 or 11 miles from Vancouver, Washington, by happenstance. There was only one single road to Vancouver and back from Vancouver. Now, it just so happens that that area where the money was found, where I believe D.B. Cooper landed, is for all intents and purposes an island. Essentially, he landed on an island. Now, technically it's a peninsula, but for all intents and purposes, it's an island. There's only one way there, one practical way there, and one practical way out, because it's surrounded by water, surrounded by the Columbia River and Lake River and Vancouver Lake, almost all the way around. I'm reasonably certain, I'm quite certain that D.B. Cooper jumping out of the jet and landing, the last fucking thing this dude is swimming across the Columbia River, or swimming across any damn river or any body of water with the cash in tow and everything else to go bury some of it on Tina Bar. Now, again, I don't live there. I live on a world that's round, not flat. So again, I believe I think he landed very near where that was found. Now, I've been in that area many times before. I replicated 70 pounds worth of parachute, money, bomb, and all that, and how difficult it would be, or how easy it would be to land in a field, go to Tina Bar, use my hand, stick, whatever I could find on the ground to bury the cash, then actually walk in the 11 miles into Vancouver, and it actually wasn't that tough at all. The first thing that shocked me, here's the first thing. I walked, I think, about 3/4 of a mile. I started this whole thing with the 70 pounds worth of gear about 3/4 of a mile from the beach, from Tina Bar. So the first thing I did is, with all the gear and everything still on, because no one's ever found it. It doesn't appear that he landed in a field and just left it laying around, because it's never been found. I'm assuming that what happened is he landed, and the first thing he wanted to do was get the hell out of Dodge, because he couldn't be absolutely certain that somebody didn't see him descending down from the clouds. There was no clouds lower than 5,000 feet. He couldn't be absolutely certain that somebody didn't see this big white canopy descending down through the clouds. I mean, it was pretty rural, but there was still ambient light in the area. And it was bright enough, I'm sure, where you would have seen a white parachute coming down if somebody had been looking up there. So again, putting myself in D.B. Cooper's shoes, I'm thinking, you know what? The first thing I do when I land is I'm getting the fuck out of Dodge, because who knows, maybe 15 minutes later, you have the sheriff driving up with his German Shepherd dogs, trying to figure out who the hell is parachuting in the area. And again, the whole skyjacking and everything was pretty much broadly known at that point, certainly by law enforcement. So again, I think D.B. Cooper probably immediately scurried to the Columbia River, which again, in my case, was about 3/4 of a mile away. Now, the first thing that I noticed is that I could do it. And it wasn't really that, it wasn't that tough. Well, let me rephrase that. I could do it, and I did it reasonably comfortably. But after 3/4 of a mile carrying 70 pounds worth of money, bomb, you know, attache, parachute, all that good stuff, I'm like, yeah, this dude isn't hiking any more than he absolutely needs to with this stuff strapped to him, because it's just simply too cumbersome. It's slowing him down. It's too heavy, and it wears you out. I mean, I'm a pretty big guy. I'm 6'3". I'm in decent shape for being an old guy. And I'm just telling you, man, like it took some strength. It took some endurance and some strength. So by the time I got to that, you know, Tina Bar, I'm like, I was pretty tired. I'm like, you know what? Let me offload this stuff. I'm not going to carry it with me. The thing that really shocked me is I found a place in the sand, and I had the money in the bag and everything else. I found a place in the sand, and just using my hands, I carved out a hole with my hands, threw in the bag, and covered it back up, and you couldn't even tell that anything was there. As I recall, that took me, I think all of that within 3 minutes. Within 3 minutes. And that actually shocked me, because I wasn't sure how difficult that was going to be. It ended up being super, super easy, because the type of sand there on Tina Bar is a pretty granular sand. It's a little, the sand is it's not like rock salt, but it's not like regular salt. It's kind of somewhere in between, probably a little closer to regular granular salt. But my point is that it was actually very, very easy, especially with the sand being slightly wet, to kind of move it to dig the hole. And because the sand was wet, it wasn't like sliding back in the hole and sort of backfilling into the hole as I'm trying to move the sand out of the way. You just moved it up, and the sand just stuck there on the side. So you could easily carve out a hole. The sand stayed in place because it was kind of like glued together with water, because it was raining that night too. Put the stuff in the hole, cover it up, wipe your hands over it, bingo, good to go. Plus it's raining, and it would also wipe out any evidence of anybody having been there, whatever the case may happen to be. And then I walked back into town, the 11 miles into town, carrying the what was ostensibly the bomb, the attaché case, and you know, I mean, it took, I don't know, a couple hours, something like that. Wasn't a big deal. So, so to back up here, it should be pretty evident here. I firmly believe that one of the critical errors, one of the critical mistakes that has been made in this case relates to the flight path of the jet and where D.B. Cooper jumped, and ultimately where D.B. Cooper landed. I'm on the record saying I am absolutely convinced that D.B. Cooper landed very near where a portion of the money was found in 1980, and that area where he landed has never been searched, I've done some searching there, but outside of that, it has never been searched. The FBI, law enforcement, was focused on another area about, as the crow flies, 10 miles away, basically, that area there. Now, I believe I've identified what is likely the reason, or the nexus, or the genesis of the error. And I think that the error primarily came from which of the jets were well, let me just put it this way. There was the airliner, and there were a couple of Air Force F-106 fighter jets that were sort of trailing the airliner loosely, kind of behind, and then ultimately to the side by about 8 or 9 miles. And then there was a T-33, an Oregon Air National Guard T-33 that entered the theater a little bit later, all kind of around that area. And I believe that when it came time for McChord Air Force Base, or someone at McChord Air Force Base, to actually plot out the path that the airliner took, and again, remember, this is 1971, this is not 2025, 1971, sort of triangulating data and all this kind of stuff. We don't exactly know what data was used. I mean, we've heard SAGE was used, and there are different components to SAGE, and we don't really know if it used or wasn't used, because the raw data has never been provided to anybody. And frankly, it never will be provided to anybody, because it's all under the purview of national defense and all that kind of stuff. But I believe that there was a very fundamental error made, and that was that I believe that it seems likely to me, not completely sure, but it seems likely to me that the error was that they were basically tracking the lead fighter jet that was trailing behind and to the east of the airliner and not the airliner itself, at least for a period of time. I don't know how that happens exactly. I mean, I've explained a few things that I think may lead to that, but either way, that's what I believe, in my mind, likely occurred. Perhaps it was something else. Perhaps there was something else there, but it seems to me that that's what happened there. And if I'm right about that, what that means is that the airliner was actually further to the west, and at the point when D.B. Cooper jumped, which was approximately 8:13 p.m., 8:13, 8:12, 8:13, right around that period of time, where that's a reasonably set time there. That very, very coincidentally, let's just say, puts the airliner a little bit south of where the money was actually found, where the money was found on Tina Bar. And I believe that D.B. Cooper jumping at that point drifts to the northeast, northeast a bit, ultimately lands, that would have put him in the fields, the agricultural fields, basically south east, a little bit southeast, half a mile to a mile southeast of where the money was found on Tina Bar, buried on Tina Bar. I believe that is what happened. I know for a lot of people that have looked at this, they think I'm smoking crack or something like that. They think that that's completely implausible. But then again, I'm sure they would have said the same thing about if I had questioned Dr. Leonard Palmer, an expert in strata, that, you know, who the hell is Eric Ulis to challenge the vaunted Dr. Leonard Palmer in strata layers, but lo and behold, Dr. Leonard Palmer was wrong. So again, mistakes happen. Remember what I said. Someone made a mistake somewhere, somehow, at some time. My job is to try to identify where the mistake occurred, where it took place. So I believe that the real D.B. Cooper parachute, not the bullshit fake fucking thing that was apparently found in North Carolina related to the McCoys and Dan Greider and all that bullshit, but I believe the real parachute is still out there and is very likely still somewhere near where that money was found in an area that has never been searched. I've been asked many times, hey, after 53 years, could the parachute still be around? Would it have rotted, or whatever the case may happen to be? The answer is yes. I believe the parachute could easily still be there. It's kind of a heavy canvas. The container's kind of a heavier canvas. The main thing that degrades natural materials or even artificial materials like nylon and stuff like that is UV light, sunlight, UV light. Obviously, the Pacific Northwest is not known for having a terrific amount of light, but moreover, I think that the parachute was covered up in some manner. Leaves under a tree trunk or something of that nature, which obviously would also prevent light from hitting the parachute. So I do believe that it's likely that there would be quite a bit of the parachute and the container would still be around. Not to mention, there are stainless steel components in that parachute, cadmium steel components in that parachute that are going to be around in 10,000 years. That stainless steel isn't going anywhere. That stuff is still there. So I think it's worth searching in that area, worth trying to find it there. The other thing is perhaps the attaché case itself that ostensibly carried the bomb or the fake bomb or whatever he had going on there, perhaps that is also buried there. Now, I tend to believe it wasn't. I think D.B. Cooper, because it was reported as being the attaché case was reported as being cheap but new. So I think that he probably took all the contents out, which is really kind of the important shit to remove. If you get pulled over or a cop stops you, whatever, and asks you to open it up for some reason, the last fucking thing you want is what appears to be a bomb. That's pretty damning evidence there. But if there's nothing but some papers in there or whatever the case may happen to be, then okay, whatever. There's nothing to really pin the guy with. So it seems to me that, like, if I were D.B. Cooper, I think I would have taken the attaché case, carry myself off as the business person that D.B. Cooper carried and presented himself as. But the components, the battery, the flares, whatever kind of crap, the electrical tape, whatever was used inside to make it look like a bomb, I think that stuff was also left behind, probably very near where the parachute was found, or rather, not found, where the parachute was ditched. And that stuff as well. That stuff would probably still be there. And importantly, I'm sure electrical tape was part of this getup, depending upon how well protected it is from the elements. If we found that electrical tape, I think there's a very good chance we find some fingerprints on the electrical tape, because anybody who's used electrical tape knows what I'm talking about. It is impossible to use electrical tape and not leave your fingerprint on the electrical tape. It's impossible. So there's a reasonably good chance that there are fingerprints on there, perhaps even some DNA, because obviously some skin cells and that type of stuff would have been pulled off. So perhaps some DNA or something of that nature. So that's very, very important from an investigative perspective, if we could actually find that. Moreover, even if there happens to be nothing related to that, you know, DNA or anything we can work with, fingerprints we can work with, we can still kind of reverse engineer where this stuff came from. Like the battery, what type of batteries were they? Can we figure out who sold those batteries back in 1971? Where would they have likely come from, that particular model? Maybe we could do the same thing with the other components, the road flares, for example. Was this a type of road flare that was only sold in Lincoln, Nebraska, or some such place or something like that? So there is value, obviously, in finding that stuff if we can find anything related to that. So again, it's important to remember that nothing, absolutely nothing, zero has ever been found in the area that the FBI officially believes D.B. Cooper jumped and landed. And that's very, very, very problematic in my mind, because it's hard to imagine that guy hauling out the parachutes and all that kind of stuff for no reason at all, just because I guess he just wanted to be a good citizen and not litter. I mean, you know, again, if you believe that, then, you know, I got some oceanfront property in Arizona to sell you, as George Strait would say. So, so that's something to keep in mind. I think that in and of itself is a pretty strong indication that, yo, dudes, you're looking in the wrong spot. He didn't land there. He was never in that area. He was somewhere else. And if we just accept that he was likely somewhere else, you know, getting caught in the weeds debating, you know, how the anatomy of an error, how the mistake was made with the flight path or whatever, kind of doesn't fucking matter. I mean, if you can get to the point where, like I did, where I'm like, listen, all I know is there was a fucking mistake made. I'm pretty damn sure about that. Jump was supposed to be here. Nothing was ever found there. Where the money was found was in a completely different area. That's actual real evidence. I'm going with where the actual real evidence was found. I'm pretty damn sure he landed much closer to that actual evidence than where some dude thinks he landed. So that's that as far as that goes. So let me kind of transition into the tie and the tie particles. And if people have been asking questions, I apologize. I've been just kind of talking and not really paying attention to the questions or whatever the case may happen to be, if there have been any. But as far as the tie and the tie particles are concerned, Tom Kay has done a terrific amount of work, and I think I should say, I want to be very clear about this too. Larry Carr, he was the FBI special agent who kind of headed up the D.B. Cooper investigation, as it were. I believe starting in 2006. It was Larry Carr who had the foresight to, and frankly was thinking outside the box enough to actually sort of lean into this a little bit and open it up, open some of the evidence up, open the evidence up to Tom Kay and his group of people. And this was back in 2007 when the conversation started. Ultimately, Tom Kay got a couple cracks at the tie and the other evidence, once in 2009, once in 2011. And that's been, I believe, absolutely critical as far as advancing this case. And primarily because the evidence, some of the particles that were pulled from the tie have been analyzed under a scanning electron microscope by a company called Macron Labs based in Chicago. And I want to be very clear that Macron Labs did the analysis. That's not to suggest that Macron Labs is endorsing Eric Ulis's theory or anybody's theory with respect to it, or perhaps it doesn't even necessarily mean that they're endorsing what the totality of the results as they appear to be. I'm just saying that Macron, a reputable company, analyze the tie particles. They've done that on a couple of occasions here, and there's been a lot of fascinating stuff that has come from those from the tie. There's been pure titanium, commercially pure titanium. There's been alloyed titanium. Again, titanium nowadays very common. You see it all over the place. The late 1960s going into 1971, different story, folks. I mean, the overwhelming majority of titanium was used in the aerospace sector and the chemical sector. And it wasn't floating around in frying pans and wedding rings and, you know, all that kind of shit, coffee mugs and all that kind of stuff, you know. Different day and different age. It's important to consider that. So that's a very big tell. It's a very big clue. Importantly, some of the pictures that were taken of these particles, high resolution pictures of, for example, some of the titanium and other particles, I think pretty clearly shows that these were titanium powder metallurgy particles. These are very small particles of titanium that appear to be acicular particles that were a type of powder titanium metallurgy. And again, powder titanium, which I won't get into the details with respect to that, but what's important to consider here is that powder titanium was researched basically from the early 60s through the 60s into the 70s until ultimately it became commercially viable in the 1980s. So considering that, you know, D.B. Cooper skyjacked the jet in November of 71, and that the tie was purchased likely around Christmas of 1964, and therefore he was probably wearing the tie 1965, 66, 67, 68, let's say right around that time frame there, 4 or 5 years, 69, whatever. That, you know, by definition, that means that's when he would have picked up the particles on the tie. So if you've got powder titanium particles on the tie, showing up on the tie from the 1960s, well, you're basically stuck focusing on companies that researched or places that researched titanium metallurgy, powder metallurgy, which again is a relatively small number of places. So, you know, again, that's something that me in particular that I've used to try to zero in on where could this guy possibly have come from, because apparently he was in an environment that had that stuff on the tie. But in addition, we've got rare earth elements, stainless steel, you know, all kinds of other metals and things of that nature on the tie. Now, about a year ago, or within the last year, one of the stubs in particular that was of particular value was reanalyzed at a deeper level by Macron. This was spearheaded by Tom Kay. And they discovered a number of other particles on the tie, but very importantly, a couple particles of uranium and a couple particles of thorium, which are very, very important particles, including an overlap particle, which was both thorium and uranium. And why I think that's really, really important, specifically the thorium and uranium particle, why I think that's important is because I believe it points to a very specific sector, a very specific type of sector, basically, and that relates to nuclear reactors, the fuel for nuclear reactors. And I consider that thorium and uranium particle the single most important particle ever discovered on the tie. And without getting into weeds with respect to that, I believe that that points to likely the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Knoxville, Tennessee. I believe D.B. Cooper worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory as an employee of Union Carbide. Union Carbide was where all of the employees at Oak Ridge National Laboratory worked. Union Carbide back then managed the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So if you worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, you were an employee of Union Carbide. And so I believe that D.B. Cooper worked there as a metallurgist, and I believe that he was working on a number of different things there, powder titanium, creating the thorium and uranium nuclear fuel that was used for a separate project there at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which was operational from 1964 1964 to 1969, and that's called the molten salt reactor experiment. I think there's a lot of evidence on the tie that points in that direction. So that's why I'm particularly thrilled about what we've seen transpire over the last, really several years, but in particular the last recent months with respect to some of the tie particles and so forth. Because again, that's why I'm saying science is actually finally catching up to this cat. Science is actually catching up to D.B. Cooper, and we'll eventually figure out who he is. If I'm a betting person right now, I'm saying D.B. Cooper was a guy who came from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, was an employee of Union Carbide during the 60s there. D.B. Cooper, at the time of the skyjacking, was about 50 years old based upon what the witnesses said, what the primary witnesses said. They pegged his age about 50 years of age. So if you've got a guy who's about 50 years old in 1971, and you kind of figure out, well, how old would he have been in 1961? He would have been 40, and all that kind of stuff. You begin to realize that it's entirely possible that D.B. Cooper was a long-time employee there at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and then maybe something happened. Maybe he lost his job when a few things with government funding were shut down, which they were. Government funding was slashed on the molten salt reactor experiment. They laid off a significant number of people related to that, tangentially and actually related to that. And perhaps D.B. Cooper was affected by that. Maybe he was transferred within Union Carbide to another one of their metals divisions, specifically Marietta, Ohio was one that I've looked at. And if he ended up at Marietta, Ohio in 1969 because of the jobs being slashed in Tennessee, it just so happens that in 1971 the government was playing hardball with Union Carbide with respect to environmental concerns and that kind of thing. And there was another big layoff there as well. So it's entirely possible in my mind that D.B. Cooper maybe was economically interrupted, if you will, by the federal government on two separate occasions within 2 years. And perhaps that's ultimately what led D.B. Cooper to skyjack the jet. Because again, in my mind, D.B. Cooper wasn't a career criminal. I think this was a one-off event. We know the guy was about 50 based upon what the witnesses said. And he appeared to be a well-educated individual. So something happened. I mean, something precipitated him deciding to, I'm going to skyjack a jet for $200K and jump out. So some sort of economic distress makes a lot of sense to me. And of course, 1971 in particular was a very tumultuous time, not only for Boeing, but for the metals industry and of course Union Carbide specifically as well. So it makes a lot of sense to me on that level. So that's kind of what I think as far as D.B. Cooper is concerned there. So where I am right now with this, I'm digging into Oak Ridge National Laboratory, digging into Union Carbide. It's a little tough all these years later, but trying to figure out, who worked there, who could have possibly been D.B. Cooper. Is there somebody there that knew somebody, whatever the case may happen to be? I don't know. I mean, there may be some stuff to work with. One of the interesting things to consider here, I've brought this up before, I know this has been talked about previously among some of the Reddit group and so forth, relates to a very interesting but true story from that area. There was a gentleman named Ralph Cooper, who was a longtime employee there at Oak Ridge National Laboratory from, I want to say he started working there in 1962, and I believe he worked there until 1997. So retired in 1997. He worked at Oak Ridge, lived in that area, Ralph Cooper. I do not believe Ralph Cooper was D.B. Cooper, in part because he was, I think, in his early to mid-30s at the time the skyjacking took place, which is just a little bit too young for me. Now, having said that, what makes this very interesting is that Ralph Cooper had a brother named Dan Cooper. And it was in 1960, I believe it was 1960, when there was a fugitive who managed to escape in that area near Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And Ralph Cooper's brother, older brother Dan Cooper, and his father were out looking for this fugitive. And I think there were some other people in the area, in the town, probably packing heat, looking for this bad guy, this fugitive. Well, somehow there was a police officer that came upon this Dan Cooper, the brother, and also the father, and something happened, and the police officer shot both of them. Shot the father and the son, Dan Cooper. The father survived, obviously ended up in the hospital, was seriously injured, but he survived. The brother, Dan Cooper, did not survive. He was killed from this wrongful death. At least the family believed was a wrongful death. Ultimately, the family sued, filed a wrongful death lawsuit, and they were asking for $200,000 for the wrongful death of Dan Cooper. Again, $200,000 was what D.B. Cooper ripped off. And then also they were asking for another $200,000 for the father being shot as well. My understanding was they were unsuccessful in suing the police department or police officer, whomever they sued, for the $400,000 or $200,000 or whatever the case may happen to be. So I'm not suggesting, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting, and again, this took place in the early 60s, so I'm not suggesting that anybody in the family, this Cooper family, was related to D.B. Cooper, whatever the case, you know, that the D.B. Cooper was a family member getting revenge on the authorities or whatever. What I am saying is that perhaps, just perhaps, D.B. Cooper, the real D.B. Cooper, working there alongside Ralph Cooper, who would have obviously known about this because this was all in the media and everything back then, perhaps that's where the name D.B. Cooper, or I'm sorry, not D.B. Cooper, where the name Dan Cooper came from. Perhaps that's where the name Dan Cooper came from. Perhaps that informs his decision to ask for $200,000. I don't know. I'm just saying it's worth considering, it's worth exploring, it's worth looking into, because that's one of those interesting coincidences that I think we owe it to ourselves if we're serious investigators to kind of look into it. I think we have to kind of go down that rabbit hole as far as that's concerned. So that's something that's really interesting to consider there. But those are the types of things that I've been digging into. I'm very fortunate. I have an uncle who is a nuclear engineer. My uncle's in his early 70s now, so he's been a nuclear engineer for decades. Very, very knowledgeable, very well connected, actually has colleagues who work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, so I'm actually leaning into him and seeing what I can learn from the colleagues that came from Oak Ridge through my uncle and so forth, and then at the same time, like I said, lean into my uncle who is knowledgeable about all these things related to nuclear energy and Oak Ridge and all that kind of stuff, thorium and uranium fuels and all that kind of stuff. So again, I'm very fortunate in that respect. So that's part of what I'm doing as well, is trying to figure that out. So so there you go. That's basically kind of a history of the case, or at least from my perspective, a history of the case, and a lot of what I've been working into to help to zero in on D.B. Cooper. I know that there are some other people doing some other things. Specifically, Tom K, I think, is interested in testing one of the other stubs related to the tie. And I don't know, there may be some other people looking at particular persons of interest or whatever, but listen, I think at the end of the day, if we're going to find D.B. Cooper, we really need to be focusing primarily on original research centered around basically the science, original searching centered around where that parachute and where the components to the bomb may be, where some of the extra money may be. That's the stuff I think we need to be focusing on, and that's the stuff that I'm focusing on, trying to lean into the media and get the word out as much as possible, keep the case alive. There are some cool things coming up with respect to that that I can't really speak to at this point, but there is some cool stuff that's coming out with respect to D.B. Cooper, so I think that there's going to be more opportunities for people to learn about the case to the degree that they don't know about it, or perhaps if they've heard of it, their memories are refreshed or whatever the case may happen to be, because there's always the possibility. There's always that possibility and that hope that somewhere, somehow, sometime, somebody sees something and says, you know what, boy, that sounds like, you know, my relative, my grandfather, or whatever, and they reach out to me, hopefully me, or, you know, maybe somebody else, maybe the FBI, and says, hey, you know, I may have some answers for you as far as this goes. So hopefully that's the case there. But so I'm gonna see if let me take a look at some of these questions here. Uh, the first part is when the event occurred, probably here. This is, hold on a second as I'm reading this. I don't think Vince was Cooper either. Yeah, I don't think Vince Peterson was likely D.B. Cooper, as I explained early on. The reason why is because I can't find any way to explain how he would have uranium and thorium on his tie. Simple as that. You know, the tie don't lie, as I say, the tie don't lie. So you can't explain the tie, you ain't the guy. Simple as that. Whether it's Vince Peterson, Sheridan Peterson, or whomever, it's as simple as that. How about the Cumberlandite? Did UC Oak Ridge handle Cumberlandite too? Very good question. That was a very good question from Mary J. About the Cumberlandite. Cumberlandite, for those of you who don't know, is the state rock of Rhode Island. It's an exceptionally rare rock, very high titanium content. It's like 10% titanium. There's also, I want to say about 80% or something like that iron, and then there's a bunch of other stuff thrown in there as well. And it's a very unusual rock. It's magnetic because of its high iron content, but the thing that's interesting about Cumberlandite is that it is only found in one place. There's only one place in the entire earth to find it, and that is a 4-acre plot of land in northern Rhode Island, the town of Cumberland, Rhode Island. It's the only place to find it. Why that's intriguing is that one of the particles, when this retesting was done of the stub, and we got sort of new particles, one of the particles that was found appears to be a particle of Cumberlandite. So that's very, very intriguing, because if it's Cumberlandite, and there's like 6 different primary things, and they're all in the proper balance, it's like, I don't know how it couldn't be Cumberlandite. I mean, what is described there is literally Cumberlandite. So that's a very intriguing thing to consider, because there aren't a hell of a lot of places this cat picks up Cumberlandite on his tie. You know, was he hanging out in the woods in Rhode Island on this 4-acre plot of land wearing a tie? Yeah, it seems unlikely. But it could have been a situation where he was handling. In fact, it seems likely to me he was handling the Cumberlandite, and I have several pieces of it here. And then touch transferred it to his tie, because it's important to note, I should say, that the particles and the things that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie appear to be from touch transfer alone. In other words, he touched something, got it on his fingertips, then transferred it to his tie as he's taking it on, putting it off, adjusting, or whatever the case may happen to be. It's not as if he was just walking around and there's Cumberlandite or titanium dust or whatever floating around in air, and it's just attaching itself to his tie. It appears to all be touch transfer. So, of course, what's interesting about Cumberlandite is that the high titanium content, as far as that goes. If you're in that area, I've been there multiple times. Actually, I was there today. Just by coincidence, I was actually at the site today again, looking at some stuff. But there are some bore holes or holes drilled into the Cumberlandite, where they took out samples of Cumberlandite, obviously to analyze in some lab somewhere at some time. I know the University of Rhode Island did some research. I've tried to determine whether Oak Ridge did any kind of research on it, and there's nothing to indicate that Oak Ridge ever looked at it. But it's worth considering that Oak Ridge was in all kinds of metallurgical research and that kind of stuff. So it is entirely plausible in my mind, given the high titanium content in the rock in particular, that this was something that they looked at some point. And that may well explain why what appears to be a particle of cumberlandite came from D.B. Cooper's tie. And it's important to note that there's just a single particle that was identified, but that's just from a single stub and a single part of the tie. Maybe there are other pieces of cumberlandite on the tie as well that are still on the tie. They just were they never were pulled off with the carbon sticky stub that Tom K put on the tie. Maybe that was a part of the tie that the piece wasn't pulled off from. So just because, that's not to say there was only one particle of cumberlandite found on the tie. There may be hundreds of particles on the tie. We've just only found one on the one stub. So that's important to remember when you're talking cumberlandite or anything else there. But that's a very good question, very intriguing, and I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. Make of it what you will. It's but definitely intriguing. At a minimum, it informs my decisions, or informs me. I'm at a point where I'm, again, this is, somebody has to explain that tie. Richard Floyd McCoy, all the rage recently with the bogus parachute find and all that other kind of shit. Like, one of the other problems with Richard Floyd McCoy, in addition to the fact that all of the witnesses said he ain't the guy, which is a very big fucking problem in my mind, but one of the other problems is that he can't explain the tie particles. I mean, this is a guy who, was, at BYU and going to church on Sunday, a Sunday school teacher, and, flying National Guard helicopters in, Provo, Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, whatever the case may happen to be. Yeah, I mean, he's not floating around cumberlandite and, thorium and uranium and titanium and alloys and all kinds of crazy shit, rare earth elements and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, that's just not happening. So, yeah, he's just not the guy. You know what I'm saying? If you can't explain the tie, he ain't the guy. It's as simple as that, like I already said, as far as that goes. So, are you still trying to get to his tie? Yes. Yes, I am still trying to get to D.B. Cooper's tie. Don't have much to report on that right now, but yes. What came of the story a few years ago where a guy had a book of his dad's jump logs and a shed the cops were searching? Okay, so that's you're talking about the Richard Floyd McCoy thing, which I think has been universally critiqued and listen, basically what I'm trying to say is this bullshit. It's pure bullshit. One of the really inconvenient things for Dan Greider and those who were pitching the Richard Floyd McCoy was D.B. Cooper story is that this parachute that was found, there are pictures of the parachute, and the picture of the parachute clearly shows that it was not the NB6 parachute. It was not the same kind of parachute that was delivered to D.B. Cooper. We know what type of parachute D.B. Cooper jumped with. Navy back 6, Navy back 8 parachute rig. We know an emergency rig. We know what it was. This was an Air Force rig, a completely different parachute. The construction is different and everything else. It's the analogy that I've given is it's kind of like saying somebody robbed a stereo department, a Radio Shack in 1971 and drove off with a, 73 Gran Torino. Then 53 years later, somebody comes along and finds a Mercedes Benz and says, this was the getaway car. No, the fucking getaway car was a Gran Torino. It wasn't a fucking Mercedes Benz. It's a completely different escape vehicle. So the parachute is a completely different escape vehicle. The parachute was not the parachute that D.B. Cooper jumped with, and there was absolutely nothing, zip, not a zero, to indicate that Richard Floyd McCoy was D.B. Cooper. So, let's see, Corona is testing 3 more stubs this summer. I haven't heard that. Maybe you know more than I do as far as that goes. Tom K may know more about that. Let's see. Do you realize what your thoughts on the flight path in Union Carbide is going to do to the vortex? I don't know what it's going to do to the vortex. I don't really give a fuck what it does to the vortex. The one thing you'll learn about me is I don't give a shit what people think. I call it like I see it. I call it like I see it, and you know, some people are gonna love it, some people are gonna hate it, some people think I'm cool, some people think I suck. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, you know, and that's all good, man. Like I don't roll like that. I just don't give a fuck. Like again, I'm open to people challenging my theories or whatever. That's what an intellectually honest person does, and there you go. And I'm also open to changing my mind if new evidence comes out or somehow something we assumed was accurate ends up getting dispelled somewhere down the line. You know, obviously, I'm willing to change my theories with respect to that. So, I have no idea what it's going to do for the vortex. I really don't give a shit. I feel very, very comfortable that we're getting very, very close to figuring out who this guy was, and that's based upon that. That is being driven by the evidence, my understanding evidence, or understanding the evidence as it stands right now in 2025. Exactly what portions of the tie has been tested, the tie, the clasp, the knot, the backside. Well, tested is an interesting word. The tie, the only thing that's been done to the tie, at least by Tom Kay and his group, is they vacuumed some portions of the tie knot and so forth, and they had these carbon sticky stubs that almost look like cufflinks that are sticky on the front, the face of it, and they kind of apply it to the tie and they pull it off, and then that with that carbon sticky stub, it's the sticky stub that gets put under an electron microscope and they see what particles were taken off of the tie. The tie itself hasn't actually been tested from what I can tell under a scanning electron microscope. I know that the FBI did some DNA testing with the tie, whatever that means, back in 2001, 2002, that time frame there. Got to remember this, you know, we're by definition using DNA technology that was a quarter century old, which was light years behind where we are today. Have they done anything with the spindle? Have they done anything with anything else that we've talked about before? I can't prove anything one way or the other. I officially just don't know. I just don't know. It seems reasonable to me that they would have, in light of the fact that he asked for DNA from Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. in 2023 and everything. But again, the FBI hasn't confirmed or denied anything, so I just don't know. As far as the percentage of the tie that has had carbon sticky stubs affixed to it, actually, I think we actually figured it out once. I almost want to say it was like 11% or something like that. Don't hold me to that, but I think it was somewhere around 11%, which would mean about 89% of the tie has actually never really been looked at. Whatever particles are on the remaining part of the tie have never been looked at. Something in that area. Either way, even if it was half the tie, even if it was full 50% of the tie had actually been tested by virtue of the sticky stubs, you know, there's an awful lot of the tie left that has never been investigated or looked into. So we just don't know. Let's see here. Do you believe D.B. Cooper had a military background? And that's Ted Braden asking the question. Well, Ted, I think there's a very good chance D.B. Cooper had a military background. I don't think it's required, but I think if you're a betting person, I think you have to say he probably had some sort of military background, if for no other reason than his age seems to indicate as much. Let's assume D.B. Cooper was 50 years old in 1971. That means he was born in 1921. And when World War II started, again, it started for the Americans December 8th, 1941. You know, the guy's 20 years old, so he's draftable at that point. So it seems really, really likely that he would have served in World War II. Again, this if he was 50 years old. Now, if he was 45, for example, then that's you know, he was only 15 at the time the war started. That is too young. And then, but there by the end of the year, by the end of the war, he would have been at a point where he could have served perhaps the very end of the war. So, but beyond World War II, you still have Korea that occurred after that. Vietnam seems unlikely because he would have been too old to serve in Vietnam in my mind. So yeah, I would say it was likely likely that DB Cooper had some military experience, and you know, given that the guy apparently didn't think twice about jumping out of a jet with a, you know, a 10,000 feet in the night with a parachute and everything else, it seems likely that he had done that before as well. It's not at all a requirement. Our good friend Martin McNally, who's a member of this group, did the same exact thing. Had never jumped before, had never put on a parachute before. So there are some crazy motherfuckers out there who will, you know, they're desperate enough where they'll just do shit like that. Now, having said that, Martin back then was kind of a young punky kid. I'm not saying he's a young punky individual now. I'm saying as a young person, I think Martin would agree that he was kind of a young punky kid. That's a different intellectual makeup than what DB Cooper appeared to display. DB Cooper appeared to be, again, more of a well-educated, certainly an older individual, relatively speaking, which I think seems to indicate that you would think he would be a little more conservative. That's an odd word to use, but a little bit more conservative with respect to his approach to pulling off crimes. In other words, I would hazard a guess that he had some sort of jump experience somewhere at some time, but it's not a requirement. Okay, DB Cooper says, I'm personally more concerned with everything that happened that night. If I could know exactly what happened and never know who Coop was, I'd be happy. That's a conversation that we've had before. You know, because there are really two parts to the story. There's who was DB Cooper, and then there's what happened. How did this whole thing unfold? How did he escape? You know, what happened to the money? All that kind of stuff. And I think, like me personally, I'd rather know who the guy was. Like, even if I got to know nothing else, even if it came out that here's the guy, here's a picture of the guy, this was the real DB Cooper, the rest of the story we're not going to tell. That's going to remain a secret, but this was the guy. I think I would rather have that than somebody flipping it around saying, well, this is exactly what happened, and the guy landed here, and then he ran off to Tennessee, and then he spent the money in Canada. Like, you know, all those kind of details are kind of interesting to know. But, like, if that doesn't come with a picture of the guy so we can actually see the real dude, okay. I mean, there's some value in that, but I'd rather know who the real guy was. But I know there are others who disagree with me. Do you think you survive the hijacking? Well, I'm assuming you meant, do you think he survived the hijacking? Yes, I believe DB Cooper 100% survived the skyjacking, and I think there's evidence that indicates as much, specifically the money find, the fact that we never found a body or anything else, I think pretty clearly indicates that there wasn't a body left behind, that he did indeed survive the skyjacking. Any more questions that people can ask here? You are one of a kind, Eric. Appreciate your work on the case. I appreciate that. I know at times I'm a controversial figure as far as that goes, but I rarely complain about it because, like I said before, it comes with the territory. You know, I mean, if you don't want to put up with people calling you a dumbass at times and giving you a rash of shit or smearing your name, whatever the case may happen to be, then just don't put yourself out there. I'm happy to do it. And like I said, who gives a shit? You know, I'm too old to worry about, personal accusations and, personal attacks and all that kind of stuff. So let's see here. Anything else there? Okay, I think that's about it. So that's it. We've been on here for close to an hour and a half at this point. So I did want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch this. That's as much as I know as far as this case is concerned here. I think this is going to be a very, very exciting year for the Cooper investigation. I'm saying it once again. I think there is a real possibility that we figure out who this guy was this year. I'm not guaranteeing it, but I think there's a very good possibility we figure out who the guy was this year. It is rapidly evolving, rapidly moving, and it's an exciting time to be involved with the DB Cooper case. So for those of you who are watching who are not yet members of the DB Cooper Mystery Group, we've got some 5,200 members. Feel free to join. Just go and find DB Cooper Mystery Group on Facebook. We've got all kinds of experts there and all kinds of other people there that are interested in the case. Some who just want to read what's going on. Others who have theories and ideas and they throw them out there. Yeah, you know, feel free to join up. Don't be afraid to ask questions. There is no question too stupid. If somebody gives you a rash of shit, you know, for being a newbie or whatever the case may happen to be, well, as one of the administrators, I'll make sure that we kick some ass and we have your back. So, so I think the other administrators and myself, we have your back. We want people to feel welcome and comfortable to ask questions or put forward theories or whatever the case may happen to be. That's not to suggest that we're not going to challenge your theories. You may come up with a theory, and you know, I may just say, yeah, it sounds like bullshit to me. But hey, you know, at least I'll tell you you're full of shit respectfully, or at least I'll attempt to tell you you're full of shit respectfully. But you could also do the same to me. So what goes around comes around. It's all good. So, all right, that's it for now. Again, any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com, or you know, join the DB Cooper Mystery Group, post some questions there. I don't know if I'll have a chance to look at all the questions and so forth that were posted during this live, but we'll go with that. And next time I do this, I'll see what I can do about changing this orientation here so we're not in portrait mode, we're actually in landscape mode, because I just think that's better. So having said all that, folks, cheers. Thanks again for joining up. And I'll see if I can gracefully turn this thing off. So, all right, folks, thanks. Bye.